This is furious HOA Karens. They wanted control. I am a paramedic in Burlington, Vermont, and I moved here 6 months ago for a job at the medical center. The Fairview Association runs my neighborhood, and from day one it felt like a place where gray areas equal HOA power grabs. I bought a townhouse with a single-car garage and a small driveway that barely fits 2 cars if you angle them right. The covenants say driveways are private property, but the HOA has a tow contract with a local vendor that treats every inch of asphalt like a hunting ground. I am rebuilding after a move, and I cannot take more disruption, but the board does not care about that. They care about compliance, and Rebecca Smith, the communications director, cares about enforcing every rule with the precision of a laser-guided missile. Rebecca showed up in my driveway on a gray Tuesday morning, holding a clipboard and a zip-tie bundle she brandishes for a sign stand, her black shoulder-length wavy hair damp from the intermittent drizzle. She wore a white light jacket and a gray bucket hat, and she pointed at my friend's car parked behind mine. "You are in violation," she said. "That vehicle does not have a guest pass displayed, and this driveway is classified as common area overflow parking under the amended site plan from 2018. I stared at her. "This is my driveway. It is on my deed." She smiled. "The site plan supersedes individual deeds when it comes to parking enforcement. You have 10 minutes to move that car or I am calling the tow company." I said, "I am not moving anything." "Call whoever you want." She pulled out her phone and dialed without breaking eye contact. The tow truck arrived in 8 minutes. I stood in the driveway with my arms crossed, watching a flatbed roll up with amber lights flashing. The driver was a guy in his 40s with a stained hoodie and a clipboard that matched Rebecca's. He did not even ask me if the car was mine. He just started hooking up the wheel lift. I said, "Stop. That is my friend's car. He is inside my house." The driver shrugged. "I got an authorization from the HOA. If you have a problem, take it up with them." Rebecca stood on the curb with her phone raised, filming the whole thing on a gimbal rig like she was documenting a felony arrest. She said, "You think this is petty. I think this is my purpose." I realized in that moment that this was not about parking. This was about control, and Rebecca had decided I was the example she needed to make. I called the police. The dispatcher said it was a civil matter and they could not intervene unless there was a crime in progress. I called my friend inside and told him to come out and move his car before they towed it. He jogged out, keys in hand, but the driver had already lifted the front wheels off the ground. My friend said, "Wait, I am right here." The driver said, "Too late. Once the lift is engaged, the tow is in progress. You can pick it up at the yard." He handed my friend a slip with an address and a fee schedule. $275 plus $50 per day storage. Rebecca said, "Next time follow the rules." She turned and walked back to her black sedan, parked perfectly within the lines at the guest lot across the street. I went inside and pulled up the HOA covenants on my laptop. I have a refinance closing in 3 weeks, and any lien threat could blow up the deal, so I needed to know exactly what the rules said. The covenants were clear. Driveways are private property. Guest parking is allowed for up to 72 hours with a pass displayed on the dashboard. The site plan Rebecca mentioned was an addendum that rezoned some overflow spaces near the clubhouse, but it did not touch private driveways. I screenshot the relevant pages and texted them to Rebecca with a message. "This is my driveway. Your tow was illegal. Expect a complaint." She replied in under a minute. "Your interpretation is incorrect. The board has legal counsel and we stand by our enforcement. You can appeal at the next meeting." I looked at the meeting schedule. The next board meeting was in 2 weeks, 1 week before my refinance closed. That afternoon, I drove to the tow yard to bail out my friend's car. The yard was a gravel lot surrounded by chain-link fence, stacked with cars in various states of decay. The office was a trailer with a window cut into the side. I paid the fee in cash and got a receipt with no company name, just a handwritten total. The attendant said, You are the third one this week from Fairview. They have been busy. I asked what he meant. He said the HOA had been calling in cars left and right, sometimes 2 or 3 a day. Most of them were guest vehicles or cars parked slightly over a line. He said the HOA had a standing authorization, so his boss did not ask questions. He just hooked and towed. I drove home and found a notice taped to my front door. It was a pre-filled violation form with boxes already checked. Unauthorized parking, guest pass not displayed, failure to comply with site plan regulations. The fine was $100, and the notice said the board could assess daily penalties until compliance was achieved. I pulled the notice down and saw that Rebecca had signed it as the issuing officer. I took a photo of the form and noticed that several boxes had been checked in the same pen, all at once like she had a stack of these ready to go. I thought about the attendant's comment, 3 cars this week. I wondered how many other people in the neighborhood were getting the same treatment. That night, I found the neighborhood group chat. It was a private channel on a messaging app, and someone had added me when I closed on the house. I scrolled back through the last 2 weeks and saw a pattern. Rebecca had been posting updates about a targeted enforcement wave. She called it a compliance initiative, but the posts were explicit. She named specific addresses, described vehicles, and coordinated with other board members about which streets to hit first. One post said, "We need to make examples or people will think the rules are optional." Another post said, "The tow vendor is on standby. Let me know when you see violations and I will dispatch immediately." I screenshot every post and saved them to a cloud folder. The next morning, I got an email from the HOA attorney. It was addressed to me and copied to the board. The email was full of bluff language meant to scare me into paying instantly. It said the board had legal authority to enforce parking rules, that my appeal would not stop the fines from accruing, and that continued non-compliance could result in a lien on my property. The email referenced the site plan amendment and said my driveway designation was under review. It ended with a deadline. Pay the fine and comply within 72 hours or face escalated enforcement. I read the email twice and realized the attorney had not actually cited any statute or covenant section. It was all vague threats and legalese designed to sound scarier than it was. I called a real estate attorney that afternoon. She was a solo practitioner who handled HOA disputes, and she agreed to review my documents for a flat fee. I sent her the covenants, the site plan, the group chat screenshots, the tow receipt, and the attorney letter. She called me back 2 days later. She said the HOA's position was garbage. The site plan did not rezone private driveways, the tow was likely illegal, and the group chat posts showed coordinated harassment that could support a claim for damages. She said the bigger problem was the tow vendor. If the vendor had been towing on HOA authorization without verifying ownership or reviewing the actual rules, the vendor could be liable too. She said I should file a complaint with the State Consumer Protection Office and send a demand letter to the board. I drafted the letter that night. I kept it short. I cited the covenant sections, attached the screenshots, and demanded a full refund of the tow fee, cancellation of the fine, and a written acknowledgement that my driveway was private property. I said I would file a formal complaint and pursue damages if they did not respond within 10 days. I sent the letter by email and certified mail. Rebecca replied within an hour. She said my letter was noted and would be reviewed by the board. She did not address any of the specific claims. She just said the board stood by its enforcement and I was welcome to attend the meeting to present my case. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday night, the one day I have a hard work deadline. I had a double shift that ended at 6, and the meeting started at 7. I told my supervisor I needed to leave on time, and he said he would cover the last hour. I drove home, changed into clean clothes, and grabbed my folder of documents. I also grabbed a small voice recorder and tucked it into my jacket pocket. Vermont is a one-party consent state, so I could record without telling anyone. I got to the clubhouse at 7:15. The meeting had already started. The board sat at a long table at the front of the room, and about a dozen homeowners sat in folding chairs facing them. Rebecca was at the far end of the table, laptop open, typing notes. The board president was a retired engineer named Harold who wore a polo shirt and reading glasses on a chain. He was mid-sentence when I walked in, talking about landscaping bids. He paused and said, "We will get to new business in a moment. Please take a seat." I sat in the back row and waited. Harold moved through the agenda quickly. Landscaping, pool maintenance, newsletter updates. Then he said, "New business. We have a compliance matter. Rebecca, would you like to present?" Rebecca stood and opened a binder. She said my address and described the violation. Unauthorized guest parking, failure to display a pass, non-compliance with site plan regulations. She said the tow was authorized under the HOA's enforcement contract and the fine was standard. She said I had been uncooperative and had sent a threatening letter to the board. She did not mention the group chat, the screenshots, or the fact that my driveway was on my deed. I raised my hand. Harold said, "You will have a chance to respond." Rebecca continued. She said the board had consulted with legal counsel and the enforcement was proper. She said if I did not pay the fine, the board would assess daily penalties and pursue a lien. She said the board could not allow selective enforcement or people would stop following the rules. Then she sat down. Harold said, "You may respond." I stood and walked to the front. I said, "My driveway is private property. It is on my deed and it is not covered by the site plan amendment." I handed Harold a copy of the covenant sections and the deed excerpt. I said, "The tow was illegal. The HOA authorized a tow from my property without verifying ownership or reviewing the rules." I handed him a copy of the tow receipt and the group chat screenshots. I said, "These posts show the board coordinated a targeted enforcement wave." Rebecca specifically named addresses and dispatched the tow vendor without cause. "This is harassment, and it is documented." Rebecca stood up. She said, "Those posts are taken out of context. The board has a duty to enforce the rules, and we were responding to complaints from other homeowners." I said, "What complaints? Show me one." She did not answer. Harold flipped through the pages I had given him. He looked at Rebecca and said, "Did we verify the site plan applies to his driveway?" Rebecca said, "Legal counsel confirmed our authority." Harold said, "I am not asking about authority. I am asking if we verified the site plan applies to this specific address." Rebecca hesitated. She said, "The site plan was approved by the board in 2018. Harold said, "That does not answer my question." Another board member, a woman named Linda, spoke up. She said, "I reviewed the site plan last month for an unrelated matter. It only covers the overflow lot near the clubhouse. It does not mention private driveways." Harold looked at Rebecca. He said, "Is that correct?" Rebecca said, "The attorney advised that the site plan gives us broad authority over parking enforcement." Harold said, "Broad authority is not the same as specific jurisdiction. If his driveway is not covered by the amendment, we may have a problem." I could see Rebecca's face tightening. She said, "We cannot second-guess every enforcement action or we will lose all credibility." Harold said, "We also cannot tow cars from private property without legal basis." He looked at me and said, "I am going to table this matter and ask our attorney to provide a written opinion. In the meantime, we will suspend the fine and any further enforcement against your property." Rebecca started to object, but Harold held up his hand. He said, "This is not a debate. We need a clear answer before we proceed." I sat down. I felt a small knot of tension loosen in my chest, but I knew this was not over. Rebecca was staring at me from across the room, and her expression said she was already planning her next move. After the meeting, I walked out to the parking lot and found a property manager waiting by my car. She was a woman in her 50s with a forced smile and a lanyard that said Fairview Management. She introduced herself as Karen, which was ironic, and said she wanted to talk. She said the board was under a lot of pressure from homeowners who felt the rules were not being enforced. She said Rebecca was passionate about compliance, and sometimes that passion led to oversteps. She said the board wanted to resolve this quietly and avoid further conflict. I said, I am not interested in quiet. I am interested in accountability. She said, what would accountability look like for you? I said, full refund of the tow fee, cancellation of the fine, a written acknowledgement that my driveway is private property, and a policy change so this does not happen to anyone else. She said she would talk to the board. The next day, I got a call from a homeowner named Thomas. He said he had been at the meeting and wanted to talk. We met at a coffee shop near the neighborhood. Thomas was in his 60s, retired, and had lived in Fairview for 12 years. He said he had seen the HOA go through cycles of aggressive enforcement, usually driven by one or two board members who wanted to prove they were tough. He said Rebecca was the worst he had seen. He said she had targeted him 2 years ago over a lawn ornament, and the dispute had dragged on for months until he filed a formal complaint with the management company. He said the board eventually backed down, but only because he had documentation. He said, you need to build a paper trail, because they will keep coming at you until you make it too expensive to continue. Thomas also said he had the actual printed covenants, the original version from when the HOA was formed. He said the current board had been amending the rules incrementally, and some of the amendments conflicted with the original covenants. He said he had been keeping track of the changes and had caught the board in several procedural violations. He said, they think they can rewrite the rules as they go, but the law does not work that way. He offered to come to the next meeting and read the relevant sections out loud. I said that would help. That weekend, I got another notice. This one was taped to my mailbox. It was a citation for failure to display a parking permit decal on my car. The HOA had recently implemented a decal system where every resident vehicle was supposed to have a sticker in the lower corner of the windshield. I had received the decal in the mail 2 weeks ago, but I had not put it on yet because I was waiting to see if the policy would stick. The citation said the fine was $50 and would double every 7 days until compliance was achieved. I peeled the notice off the mailbox and saw that Rebecca had signed it. I also saw that the same notice was taped to 3 other mailboxes on my street. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA drama. I took photos of all the notices and texted them to Thomas. He replied immediately. He said the decal policy had been implemented without a proper vote. The board had announced it in a newsletter, but they had never put it on a meeting agenda or allowed homeowner comment. He said that was a procedural violation, and any fines based on the policy were unenforceable. He said I should file a formal objection and demand a vote. I drafted the objection that night and sent it to the board by email. I also posted a summary in the neighborhood group chat, which Rebecca still controlled. Within an hour, she had deleted my post and sent me a private message. She said, "You are disrupting the community and creating unnecessary conflict. If you continue, the board will consider additional enforcement actions." I screenshot the message and added it to my evidence folder. Monday morning, I got a call from the tow yard attendant. He said his boss wanted to talk to me. I drove over during my lunch break. The boss was a guy in his 50s named Ray, and he ran the yard out of a double-wide trailer behind the fence. He said he had heard I was making noise about the Fairview tows, and he wanted to set the record straight. He said the HOA had a contract with his company, and the contract gave the HOA authorization to request tows from any vehicle parked in violation of the rules. He said his drivers did not verify ownership or check deeds, they just followed the authorization. I asked to see the contract. He hesitated, then pulled out a binder and flipped to a tab. He showed me a 2-page agreement dated 2019. I took a photo of the cover page with my phone. The contract had an expiration date of December 2022. I said, "This contract expired 2 years ago." Ray looked at the page and his face went pale. He said, "That cannot be right." I said, "It is right. You have been towing cars on an expired contract, which means every tow since 2023 was unauthorized." Ray said, "The HOA told us the contract was current." I said, "The HOA lied." I left the yard and called my attorney. She said the expired contract was huge. It meant the tow company had no legal authority to remove vehicles from the HOA property, and every tow was potentially a conversion claim. She said I could sue the tow company, the HOA, or both. She said the tow company would probably settle immediately to avoid liability, and the HOA would be on the hook for any damages. She said, "This is your trump card. Do not play it until you are ready to end this." I decided to hold the trump card and see how far Rebecca would push. I did not have to wait long. 2 days later, I came home from a night shift and found a bright orange boot clamp locked onto my front wheel. There was a sticker on my windshield that said the vehicle was immobilized for repeated parking violations, and the boot would be removed upon payment of all outstanding fines, plus a $75 removal fee. The sticker did not say who had placed the boot or when. I called the HOA office and got voicemail. I called Rebecca directly and she answered on the second ring. She said, "You were warned. You have multiple unpaid fines and you have refused to comply with the decal policy. The boot stays until you pay." I said, "I am parked in my own driveway. You have no authority to boot my car here." She said, "The board disagrees. You can appeal at the next meeting." Then she hung up. I called Thomas. He said, "They are trying to force you into submission. Do not pay anything. Document everything and let them dig their own grave." I took photos of the boot from every angle. I took photos of the sticker. I took a video walking around the car and narrating the scene. I uploaded everything to my cloud folder. Then I called a locksmith. The locksmith was a guy named Eddie who said he had dealt with HOA boots before. He said most of them were cheap models that could be removed with a standard key or a bolt cutter, but he recommended against cutting it because that could give the HOA grounds to claim vandalism. He said the better move was to force the HOA to remove it themselves and document their refusal if they did not. I thanked him and decided to wait. That afternoon, I got a text from Rebecca. She said the board had scheduled an emergency hearing to address my continued non-compliance. The hearing was set for Friday at 6, the same day my refinance was supposed to close. I replied, "I will be there." She did not respond. I called my attorney and told her about the boot and the hearing. She said, "This is escalating fast. They are trying to create a record of non-compliance to justify a lien. You need to be ready to hit them with the expired contract and the group chat evidence at the hearing." I said, "I am ready." Thursday night, I was working a late shift when I got a call from Thomas. He said he had been reviewing the HOA bylaws and had found something important. The bylaws required the board to give at least 10 days' notice for any hearing that could result in a fine or lien. The emergency hearing was only 2 days away, which meant it was procedurally invalid. He said, they cannot assess a lien at a hearing that violates the notice requirement. Even if they try, it would not hold up in court. I asked him to bring the bylaws to the hearing and be ready to read that section out loud. He said he would. Friday came fast. I finished my shift at 5 and drove straight to the clubhouse. The parking lot was packed. There were at least 30 homeowners inside, more than I had seen at any previous meeting. I realized word had gotten out about the hearing and people wanted to see what would happen. I found a seat near the front and set my voice recorder on the chair beside me. Thomas was already there, sitting in the second row with a thick binder on his lap. Harold called the hearing to order. He said, "This is a special hearing to address continued parking and compliance violations at the property owned by the respondent. Rebecca will present the board's case. Rebecca stood and walked to the front. She had a folder full of printed photos and a stack of pre-filled violation forms. She started talking, and I could see she had prepared a full presentation. She said I had accumulated 4 separate violations over the past 2 weeks. Unauthorized guest parking, failure to display a decal, boot removal interference, and failure to pay fines. She said the board had given me multiple opportunities to comply, and I had refused every time. She said the board was prepared to assess a lien on my property if I did not pay the outstanding balance and comply immediately. She walked through each violation, showing photos of my car, my friend's car, and the boot. She said the board had legal authority under the covenants and the site plan to enforce parking rules, and my refusal to comply was disrupting the community. She said other homeowners had complained that I was getting special treatment, and the board needed to show that the rules applied to everyone. She did not mention the expired tow contract. She did not mention the group chat. She did not mention the procedural violations Thomas had found. She just painted me as a problem resident who refused to follow the rules. When she finished, Harold said, "The respondent may present his defense." I stood and walked to the front. I had a folder with 3 tabs, marked evidence, bylaws, and contract. I started with the bylaws. I said, "This hearing is procedurally invalid." The HOA bylaws require 10 days' notice for any hearing that could result in a fine or lien. This hearing was called with 2 days' notice. Under the bylaws, any action taken tonight is unenforceable. Rebecca interrupted. She said, "The board has authority to call emergency hearings when immediate action is required." I said, "Show me where the bylaws say that." She did not respond. Thomas stood up. He said, "I have the bylaws right here." He opened his binder and read the section out loud. It was clear. 10 days written notice, delivered to the respondent's address on file with a description of the charges and an opportunity to review the evidence in advance. The hearing had not met any of those requirements. Harold looked at Rebecca. He said, "Did we follow the notice procedure?" Rebecca said, "We sent an email and a text message. That is sufficient notice." Thomas said, "The bylaws specify written notice delivered to the address on file. Email and text do not meet that standard unless the respondent has agreed to electronic notice in writing." "I have not agreed to anything," I said. Harold rubbed his forehead. He said, "If the hearing is procedurally invalid, we cannot take any enforcement action tonight." Rebecca said, "We cannot let him walk away from this. He has been flagrantly violating the rules for weeks." Harold said, "Then we need to schedule a proper hearing with proper notice." Rebecca looked like she wanted to flip the table. She said, "Fine. We will reschedule. But the fines are still accruing, and the boot stays until he pays." I said, "The boot is coming off tonight." Harold said, "We are not authorized to remove it without payment." I said, "You are not authorized to place it in the first place." I pulled out the contract tab and slid a copy across the table. I said, "This is the tow contract between the HOA and the tow company. It expired in December 2022. For the past 2 years, every tow and every boot has been placed under an expired contract, which means none of them were authorized." The room went silent. Harold picked up the contract and read the cover page. He looked at Rebecca. He said, "Is this true?" Rebecca said, "The tow company told us the contract was current." I said, "The tow company was wrong. I have a signed statement from the yard owner confirming the contract expired and was never renewed. The HOA has been authorizing tows with no legal authority, and every affected homeowner has a claim for conversion and damages." Rebecca's face went red. She said, "This is irrelevant. The board acted in good faith based on information from the vendor." I said, "Good faith does not eliminate liability. The HOA authorized illegal tows, and the board is responsible." Harold said, "We need to consult with our attorney before we proceed." I said, "Your attorney already knows. I pulled out the last document in my folder. It was an email from the HOA attorney dated 4 months ago addressed to the board. The subject line said tow contract renewal required. The body of the email said the tow contract had expired and the board needed to execute a new agreement immediately to avoid liability. The email warned that any tows conducted without a valid contract could expose the HOA to legal claims. The email had been sent to the full board, including Rebecca. It had been ignored. I said, "This email proves the board knew the contract was expired and continued to authorize tows anyway. That is not good faith. That is negligence." I walked to the side door of the clubhouse, propped it open, and set my phone on speaker mode. I played the email out loud so neighbors standing outside could hear it in real time. The attorney's voice was calm and professional, but the words were damning. The board had been warned, and they had done nothing. Rebecca stood up and said, "You had no right to access that email." I said, "I did not access it." A homeowner on the board forwarded it to me because they were concerned about the liability. That homeowner is here tonight, and they are willing to testify that the board received the email and chose to ignore it. Harold stood up. He said, "This meeting is adjourned. We need to consult with legal counsel immediately." Rebecca said, "You cannot adjourn in the middle of enforcement." Harold said, "I just did." He looked at me and said, "The boot will be removed tonight, and all fines assessed under the expired contract will be refunded. We will schedule a proper hearing if the board decides to pursue further action, but based on what I have seen tonight, I do not think that is likely." Rebecca started to argue, but Harold walked out. The other board members followed. Rebecca stood alone at the front of the room staring at me. The homeowners in the audience started clapping. It was not loud, but it was steady and it filled the room. Rebecca grabbed her laptop and her folder and walked out without another word. I stayed for a few minutes to talk to Thomas and a few other homeowners who wanted to thank me. One woman said she had been towed 3 times in the past year and had paid over $800 in fees. She said she was going to file a claim for a refund. Another man said his car had been booted twice, and he had been too afraid to fight it because he thought the HOA would put a lien on his house. He said, "You just saved me a lot of money and a lot of stress." Thomas shook my hand and said, "You played that perfectly. You held the trump card until the right moment, and you made them destroy their own credibility." I said, "I did not chase her accusations, because I already had the receipts." The boot was removed the next morning. A tow company truck showed up at 7, and a driver unbolted the clamp without saying a word. I watched from my front window and took a photo of the driver loading the boot into the truck. That same day, I received an email from the HOA attorney. The email was short. It said the board had voted to suspend all parking enforcement pending a full review of the tow contract and the compliance policies. It said all fines assessed under the expired contract would be refunded within 30 days. It said the board would be implementing new procedures to ensure proper notice and due process for future hearings. The email ended with a sentence that made me smile. "The board has directed that no further enforcement actions be taken against your property without written approval from legal counsel." 2 weeks later, I got a check in the mail for the full tow fee, the boot removal fee, and all the fines Rebecca had assessed. The check came with a letter from Harold. The letter said the board had accepted Rebecca's resignation as communications director. It said the board was conducting an internal audit of all enforcement actions taken over the past 2 years, and any homeowner who believed they had been improperly fined or towed could submit a claim for review. The letter also said the board had hired a new management company to oversee compliance and ensure that enforcement was conducted fairly and legally. The letter ended with an apology. It said the board regretted the way my case had been handled, and they were committed to rebuilding trust with the community. I never saw Rebecca again. I heard from Thomas that she had moved out of the neighborhood a few months later. He said she had tried to run for a seat on the board in another HOA across town, but the homeowners there had Googled her name and found posts about the Fairview scandal. She withdrew her application. Thomas said, "Karma works slowly, but it works." The refinance closed on time. The lender had asked for an HOA certificate confirming there were no outstanding fines or liens, and the new management company had provided it without issue. I got the keys to a lower interest rate and a monthly payment I could actually afford. The whole mess had cost me time, stress, and a few sleepless nights, but it had also taught me something important. HOAs only have the power you give them. If you document everything, know your rights, and refuse to be intimidated, they will back down. Not because they want to, but because they have to. A few months later, the HOA held an election for the open board seat. 3 people ran, and Thomas won by a landslide. He said his first priority was revising the parking policies to eliminate the decal requirement and the TOW on-site rules. He said his second priority was establishing a homeowner grievance process so people could challenge fines without having to hire an attorney. He said, "We are going to run this HOA the way it should have been run from the beginning, with transparency, fairness, and respect for property rights." I voted for him, and so did most of the neighborhood. One afternoon, I was working in my driveway when a new neighbor moved in across the street. She was unloading boxes from a truck, and I walked over to introduce myself. She said her name was Lisa, and she had just closed on the house. She said she had read the HOA covenants before buying, and they seemed reasonable. She asked if the HOA was strict about enforcement. I said, "It used to be. Not anymore." I told her the short version of what had happened, and her eyes went wide. She said, "So you are the guy who took down the HOA Karen?" I laughed and said, "I just held them accountable." She said, "Well, I am glad you did. I was worried about moving into an HOA, but if the board is fair now, I think it will be fine." The neighborhood settled into a new normal. The tow truck stopped prowling the streets. The violation notices stopped appearing on mailboxes. The group chat became a place for actual community conversation instead of enforcement coordination. People started hosting block parties again, and the clubhouse started booking events that were not board meetings. It felt like a real neighborhood for the first time since I had moved in. I still see the stack of pre-filled violation forms in my evidence folder sometimes. I keep them as a reminder of what happens when a small group of people decides they can rewrite the rules to suit their agenda. Rebecca thought she could use the HOA as a weapon, and for a while, it worked. But the thing about weapons is that they can be turned around. I did not set out to take down the board or force a resignation. I just wanted to park in my own driveway without being harassed. But when the HOA overreached, I pushed back, and the whole system collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The funniest part of the whole saga happened a few weeks after the hearing. I was at a coffee shop near the neighborhood when I saw Rebecca walk in. She did not see me at first. She was at the counter ordering, and when she reached into her bag for her wallet, a key slipped from her hand. It was a small brass key, the kind that unlocks a boot clamp. The key skittered across the pavement outside the door, and she had to chase it down the sidewalk. I watched through the window as she crouched on the ground, trying to grab it before it rolled into a storm drain. She almost lost it twice, and by the time she finally got it back, she was red-faced and breathing hard. I did not say anything. I just sipped my coffee and smiled. The settlement that came out of the whole mess was better than I had hoped. The board agreed to refund every tow fee, boot fee, and fine that had been assessed under the expired contract. They agreed to a no-contact directive that prohibited Rebecca or any board member from initiating enforcement actions against me without written approval from legal counsel. They agreed to a written ban on retaliatory enforcement, with penalties for violations that included automatic removal from the board and personal liability for damages. The settlement was signed by every board member and filed with the management company. It was the most comprehensive HOA settlement I had ever seen, and my attorney said it set a precedent that other homeowners in the neighborhood could use if they faced similar issues. The best part of the settlement was the policy change. The board voted to eliminate the decal requirement, the TOW on-site rules, and the pre-filled violation forms. They voted to require photographic evidence and written documentation for every enforcement action. They voted to implement a mandatory 30-day notice period before any fine could be assessed, with an automatic right to appeal. They voted to hire an independent compliance officer who was not a board member and who reported directly to the management company. The policy changes were not just for me. They applied to the entire HOA, and they made it almost impossible for another Rebecca to weaponize the rules the way she had. Thomas told me later that the board had also received a letter from the State Consumer Protection Office. Someone, probably one of the homeowners who had been towed, had filed a complaint about the expired contract and the predatory towing practices. The state had opened an investigation, and the tow company had been fined and placed on probation. The HOA had been warned that any future violations could result in the board members being held personally liable for damages. Thomas said, "You did not just win your case, you changed the entire system." I said, "I just wanted to park in my driveway." He said, "Sometimes that is all it takes." A year later, I ran into Ray, the tow yard owner, at a gas station. He recognized me and walked over. He said, "I want to thank you." I said, "For what?" He said, "For exposing the expired contract." After the hearing, I went back through all the tows we had done for Fairview over the past 2 years. I realized we had been operating on bad information, and it could have cost me my business. I renegotiated the contract with the new board, and now we only tow when there is a clear violation and written authorization. It has cut our volume in half, but it has also cut our liability to zero. I said, "Glad it worked out." He said, "Me too. And I am sorry about your friend's car." I refunded his fee out of my own pocket after I found out the contract was expired. I said, "I appreciate that." He nodded and walked back to his truck. The neighborhood is different now. People smile when they see me. They wave when I am working in the yard. They stop to chat when I am checking the mail. A few of them have asked for advice about their own HOA disputes, and I have been happy to share what I learned. The biggest lesson I can offer is this: document everything. Know your rights. Do not be afraid to push back. And if the HOA overreaches, make them prove it. Most of the time, they cannot. I still live in the same townhouse. I still park in the same driveway. The only difference is that now, when I pull in after a long shift, I do not have to worry about finding a boot on my wheel or a violation notice on my door. I do not have to worry about surprise tows or predatory fines or a board member with a vendetta. I can just park, walk inside, and go to bed. That is all I ever wanted. The group chat is still active, but the tone has changed. Instead of enforcement updates and compliance threats, it is full of event announcements, neighborhood news, and the occasional debate about whether the pool should open early this year. Rebecca's name does not come up anymore. It is like she was never there. Thomas says that is the best outcome. He says, "When you beat a bully, you do not need to keep talking about it. You just move on and make sure it does not happen again." I thought about that a lot over the past year. Rebecca was not a cartoon villain. She was not evil. She was just someone who had a little bit of power and decided to use it in the worst possible way. She thought she could hide behind the rules, behind the board, behind the attorney's letters. She thought she could intimidate people into compliance, and for a while it worked. But the moment someone stood up and said no, the whole thing fell apart. The rules she had weaponized turned against her. The board she had controlled turned on her. The neighbors she had tried to scare started asking questions. And in the end, she had no choice but to resign, because the alternative was worse. I do not feel sorry for her. She had plenty of chances to back down. She could have admitted the tow was a mistake, She could have refunded the fee and apologized. She could have listened when I cited the covenants and the deed. But she did not. She doubled down, escalated, and tried to crush me with fines and threats and hearing procedures. She thought she could outlast me. She thought I would give up. She was wrong. The trump card I held, the email from the attorney warning the board to stop, was the key to everything. Without that email, the hearing would have been a he said, she said. The board could have claimed they did not know the contract was expired, and I would have had to prove negligence. But the email made it impossible for them to hide. It showed they had been warned, and they had ignored the warning. It showed they had prioritized enforcement over legality. It showed they had put the entire HOA at risk just to prove a point. And when I played that email on speaker outside the clubhouse so neighbors could hear it in real time, I was not just defending myself. I was exposing the board's recklessness to the entire community. That is what forced the settlement. That is what forced Rebecca to resign. That is what changed the HOA. Looking back, the whole experience taught me something about HOAs that I did not understand before. They are not inherently bad. They are not inherently good. They are just structures, and the people who run them determine whether they help or hurt. When the board is reasonable, transparent, and fair, an HOA can maintain property values, organize events, and create a sense of community. But when the board is run by people who see the rules as a weapon, the HOA becomes a nightmare. The only way to stop that is to hold the board accountable. File complaints, attend meetings, document violations, and if the board refuses to listen, take it to the next level. Hire an attorney. File a lawsuit, go public, make them pay the cost of their overreach. That is what I did, and it worked, not because I was smarter or tougher or more prepared than anyone else. It worked because I refused to give up, and I had the evidence to back up every claim I made. Rebecca thought she could bully me into silence. The board thought they could bury me in fines and legal threats. The tow company thought they could keep operating on an expired contract without consequences. They were all wrong, and they all paid for it. The final vindication came 6 months after the settlement. The State Consumer Protection Office completed its investigation and issued a public report. The report found that the HOA had engaged in systematic violations of homeowner rights, including unauthorized tows, improper fines, and procedural failures. The report recommended that the HOA be placed under supervision by the management company for 2 years, with quarterly audits to ensure compliance with state law. The report also recommended that the board members who had overseen the violations be required to complete training on HOA governance and fiduciary duties. The report named Rebecca specifically as the primary driver of the enforcement abuses, and it noted that her resignation had been a necessary step to restore trust in the board. I read the report online, and I felt a sense of closure. The state had confirmed what I had been saying all along. The HOA had overreached, the board had ignored the rules, and the homeowners had suffered because of it. The report was public, so anyone who Googled Rebecca's name or the Fairview Association would see it. That was justice, and it was permanent. Thomas called me after the report came out. He said, "You should be proud. You did not just win your case, you forced systemic change." I said, "I just wanted to park in my driveway." He laughed and said, "That is what makes it so perfect. You were not trying to be a hero, you were just trying to live your life. And when they tried to stop you, you fought back with the rules they claimed to care about. That is the most satisfying kind of payback." He was right. The HOA attorney forced a reversal to reduce liability. Rebecca's complaint was ruled unfounded, with evidence cited. I deployed a statute citation read into the minutes that shut the threat down. And Rebecca's boot clamp key slipped from her hand and skittered across the pavement in the most poetic moment of karma I have ever witnessed. All of it happened because I refused to back down, and because I built a case that was too strong to ignore. The neighborhood is peaceful now. The board is functional. The rules are fair. The enforcement is transparent. and I can park in my driveway without looking over my shoulder. That is all I ever wanted, and I got it. But I also got something more. I got the knowledge that when you stand up to a bully, document the abuse, and fight back with the truth, you can win. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. That is worth more than any refund check or settlement agreement. That is the real victory. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate you being here.